the floor is yours. You need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. Thank
Okay,
you.
awesome. So let me just turn on the slideshow. So hello, everyone, and thank you, Juan, for this very nice introduction to my paper. I'm glad to present my findings about medieval video games at this amazing conference. And let us start. No, okay. So probably some slides will turn on with a little bit of delay, so I hope it will not be a problem. To begin with, as we all know, over the last few decades, video games have become a dominant mass medium in popular culture. And luckily, with the advancement of so-called game studies, recent research has been gradually removing the stigma attached to video games as transmitters of violence, negative physiological or psychological effects, as this meme on my slide can show to you. Instead, scholarly circles have proposed to perceive computer games as so-called cultural artifacts that can mirror social, political, cultural values and practices. It has been stated convincingly quite recently by Jens Seifert and Howard Noshaft that video games serve as a powerful educational and polemical tool, and I share this opinion wholeheartedly. So-called medieval video games, where a player is situated in the simulated atmosphere of the Middle Ages, remain, at least so far, at the forefront of the global entertainment market because of their aesthetic appearance and romanticized content. Hence, for many general users, otherwise not willing to immerse themselves into voluminous monographs on the Middle Ages, they mark the perception of the medieval past, which unfortunately sometimes can be distorted. Following Louis Darson's and Robert Wood's definition of medievalism as beliefs about the Middle Ages in contemporary popular culture, I will assess various forms of medievalism in my paper. So please go on. Here it is. So how can we study video games and their effect on our understanding of medievalism? Equating computer games with movies, the preceding scholarship was mostly focused on textual criticism to assess either the content or the narrative of historical computer simulations. Despite its undeniable effectiveness, unfortunately, this approach almost totally ignores game mechanics and thus, to us, proves limited. Hence, to understand how different video games shape different models of medievalism, I suggest turning to procedural rhetoric, also known as simulation rhetoric. This theory, which was coined by Ian Bogost, studies the processes of non-verbal rules, programming how the simulated world interacts with the player. Namely, game developers design video games with a series of predetermined rules that the player must follow in order to win. Interacting with the virtual world, the player must learn these rules and deduce what is possible and what is impossible in order to reach the ultimate goal of winning. Ian Bogost and Gonzalo Frasca have persuasively argued that constant contact with these rules actually makes strong ties between the player and the simulation model, and thus has a persuasive educational value. To put it simply, one can study certain concepts through playing a video game, even if they do not follow the game's narrative. The next slide will appear shortly after. So to proceed to the main problem and research question, let us state that the same logic applies to medieval video games. Surprisingly, although the number of medieval-oriented computer games, such as, for example, Skyrim or The Witcher 3 or Dragon Age and whatever, keeps rocketing up each year, scholars who have studied simulation rhetoric and the Middle Ages have considered only turn-based or real-time historical strategies in their analysis. Hence, our scholarly understanding of how game rules and procedures shape players' perception of medievalism is predominantly one-sided and represented by the selective analysis of several quasi-realistic strategies So to give you a few examples, for example, medieval Total War or the well-known series Crusader Kings. Meanwhile, for some reason, role-playing games, also known as RPGs, or realistic survival action games where the player controls a character with their own backstory and motivations, have received almost no attention in the scholarly debates about the Middle Ages and procedurality. So this problem leads me to my main research question, which I addressed today, which is what can one learn about medievalism from video games' predetermined rules? I believe that such an answer cannot be provided by studying only one genre of video games. So, to answer my research question and demonstrate key dissimilarities in modeling the Middle Ages in various types of computer simulations, I suggest comparing games which belong to various genres and different periods, as you can see here on the slide. I deliberately propose to look at medievalism in quasi-realistic video game bestsellers that might have reached the majority of modern-day gamers over the last decade. So you can see here in the brackets the dates of release of the games which I have chosen. Confined by the time and format of my presentation, I do not aspire to present an all-embracing analysis of the whole gaming industry, and instead I will focus on three well-known case studies, namely turn-based strategy Civilization V, action RPG Kingdom Come Deliverance, and, well, quite a brand new survival simulator called Medieval Dynasty. Considering failures and successes that other users or I experienced while playing these games, I will showcase how sometimes contradictory imperatives, which either impede or encourage our advancements through the game, shape three distinctive nonverbal messages of the Middle Ages in popular culture. So our first example will be Civilization V. And in 2010, Firaxis Game Studio released this fifth and arguably the most popular part of this Civilization series. Civilization generally is a genre-defining game, and it heavily influenced turn-based strategy games at the eve of the new millennium especially. It is, well, it has quite an ambitious goal, which is to simulate the interplay among almost all human civilizations, and in the beginning, the player is placed in control of a prehistoric tribe, and then he or she must guide it through centuries to an ancient empire, medieval kingdom, and eventually a modern-day polity. Dominance over the world, predictably, is the game's ultimate goal, which one may achieve either through military, cultural, religious, economic, or scientific progress. Sid Meier, the founding father of Civilization, has argued that its gameplay is a series of interesting choices, as I put it here on my slide. As the game rules require, the player is not allowed to move to the next turn without assigning a task for every unity under their control, or choosing upgrades from the development trees, for example, technologies, buildings, or social institutions. So in theory, the game offers a wide number of decision paths to the player. They can decide where and when to found cities, which resources to extract, what units and buildings to construct, when to wage war, and when to make allies. And even more, what I found very interesting, every civilization actually can erect whatever architectural monument, regardless of its origin. So, for example, it can be the Great Pyramids located somewhere in China, or the Neuschwanstein Castle, sorry for my pronunciation, I maybe put it wrong, located somewhere in the Republic of Venice. So as the developers state, the player is constantly teased with the possibility of governing their nation any way they want, but still, in reality, due to the restrictive predetermined rules, there is a very narrow range of options that are actually available to the player. The interplay of prohibitions and requirements defines the linear-based way in which the game depicts the Middle Ages. And I call this model of medievalism one-sided historiography. So to give you an example, Okay, here is the next slide. To observe this notion in detail, let us consider how the game procedures limit our understanding of humanism, so the concept well known to many of us. Humanism in Civilization 5 is a gameplay bonus, significantly boosting the player's scientific dominance over other nations. As a part of the rationalism, so it is here on the left, social policy tree, humanism can be activated only in the Renaissance era, once the player has previously unlocked such medieval technologies as theology, guilds, university education, and chivalry. And surprisingly, under no circumstances the player is able to launch humanism while playing in the medieval era. Consequently, the game ignores the existence of so-called Carolingian, Ottonian, or 12th century pre-humanisms, which are actually actively discussed among historians even today. Representing the procedures surrounding humanism in such a straightforward, immutable manner makes the argument to the player that this is how and when humanism should happen. As a result, the game presents some medieval elements through their relationship to the broader structuralist model, and it selectively builds a linear quasi-structuralist historiography of the Middle Ages and excludes other historical details and historiographical alternatives. So if Civilization 5 places the player in charge of an entire polity, another game, Kingdom Come Deliverance, offers to experience the Middle Ages from a perspective of a single soldier, Henry, who is placed in the medieval kingdom of Bohemia at the eve of the Hussite Wars. Released in 2018, this role-playing action game earned highly positive reviews and critical appraisals for its focus on hyperrealism. Designed as an open-world environment from a first-person perspective, the game allows players to upgrade their combat, speech, stealth, and other abilities depending on what the player does and says. Apart from great authentic combat mechanics, the gameplay is heavily based on the system of dialogues, which you can see here in this slide, which often may help the player to avoid skirmish or advance through the game with a bonus. Key variables affecting success in negotiating with non-playable characters are the player's skills of charisma, intimidation, and speech, together with his reputation in a given area, as this slide indicates. Surprisingly, in Kingdom Come Deliverance, clauses have become an additional factor, influencing success in dialogues and a comfort playthrough experience. Each of 16 available clothing slots not only provides protection against various types of weapons, but also boosts the player's charisma if the garments are, first of all, clean and appropriately combined. So the next slide should appear shortly after. For example, dressed in heavy plate armor and freshly washed clothes, the main character will get a substantial bonus to his charisma and receive cordial greetings from NPCs who will respectfully call him a knight, as you can see here on the slide. Otherwise, if some elements of body wear and armor become worn, dirty, bloody, or simply do not fit each other, the level of the player's charisma will significantly drop, and other characters will become more suspicious towards him. Such alteration may result in particular difficulties in communication with local traders or key quest characters and will lead to constant checkups from the guardsmen. In this way, developers' primarily anthropological preoccupation with historical realism, even if it comes to secondary procedural details, such as regular laundry and repair of clothes, constructs a hierarchic social model of medievalism. Undoubtedly, designing such personalized experience, and even for me, makes the game more interesting and creates a strong associative and emotional tie between the player and the simulated society. But also, as an additional matter of interest, the aforementioned accurate procedures around clothes in the game fight the stereotype about the dirty or dark Middle Ages. And the last example of how video games can articulate medievalism through their procedural capacity is a brand new simulator called Medieval Dynasty. So set somewhere in Europe in the early Middle Ages, this open world computer model embraces elements of survival action, role-playing game from a first-person perspective, and a city building simulation, which is to me quite an interesting mixture. Unlike Kingdom Come Deliverance, Medieval Dynasty a priori deprives the player of fighting non-playable characters, at least for now, because the game is still under construction, so it's a beta version. As an alternative, one can enhance the main hero's skills in hunting, crafting, and gathering resources, which will help to erect utility buildings necessary to attract more villagers to the settlement, which is the ultimate goal of the whole game. According to posts on the Steam gaming platform, users experienced high hopes about mechanics and content of this game. However, since last autumn, when the game was released and became open to players, it received more and more negative reviews, as you can see here. So I put just one example, but there are many of them. These reviews are mainly criticizing the apparent discrepancy between the game's procedural prohibitions and its main objectives. So let's look at several examples. So foraging is one of the most vivid examples illustrating the game's procedural paradoxes about the Middle Ages, how I call it. Focusing primarily on mining resources necessary for surviving seasons and town building, which is, well, food and coin, Medieval Dynasty subtly impedes the player from hunting wild animals or foraging. And alternatively, it encourages them to interact and trade with non-playable characters in order to sustain the main character more easily. For instance, as you can see on the slide, so as I put here, pursuing the career of a hunter, one has to consume several boar carcasses to get through one day, which is unbelievable to me, and may trade collected animal hides at the price of 3 coins, regardless of the animal. So fox, boar, and rabbit hides will have practically the same price. Paradoxically, at the same time, 3 small pieces of bread will be an average to the player for the whole game day. Moreover, a loaf of bread can be sold for a price 12 times higher than the one for selling animal trophies, which is also strange. Generally, communicating with the non-playing characters and completing main quests is the easiest way to earn enough coin for constructing a building to attract new villagers to the settlement. Therefore, with this intricate system of grinding resources, the game transmits the image of the Middle Ages shaped through commerce and social ties. Despite the game's biological inaccuracies, many users have admitted that contacting with this model of medievalism felt like a tedious contemporary real life to them. So, for example, they have to pay taxes. And this is one of the most vivid examples of this real life. And to conclude, although computer simulations might make an attempt to model the real world as closely as possible, the fact remains that the procedures available are ultimately programmed by the game's authors, first of all, and the experience design. Hence, often the simulation's non-verbal message is subjective, inexact, or limited. As we can see in the 3 examples that I have just demonstrated, the image of the Middle Ages changes depending on a game's procedural capacity and, of course, genre. While predetermined rules of Civilization V shape our perception of medievalism in the form of a linear historiography, more personalized Kingdom Come Deliverance and Medieval Dynasty, where one plays for a character, engage with the Middle Ages by presenting models of feudal hierarchy and commercial relations framed by close social ties. Yet, I state that despite the 3 reviewed models of medievalism are in a way distorted in order to be more appealing to a general user, their aspiration to historical accuracy transmits valuable messages about the Middle Ages and thus have an educative value. Well, that's it for now, and I will stop here. If you have any comments or questions, I will be glad to receive them after the whole session. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. That was very interesting. Our second panelist is Robert Houghton. Robert is a lecturer in medieval history at the University of Winchester. His research focuses on the political and social history of Italy in the Central Middle Ages and on the interaction between medievalisms and gaming. His recent publications include the edited volume Playing in the Crusades from 20, which is coming out this year, and he's currently writing a monograph titled The Middle Ages in Computer Games. He is the games editor on the Public Medievalist and is created on the Crusader Kings series of strategy games. So Robert, the floor is yours. Don't forget to unmute yourself. And I need to make you co-host. Yeah, give me a moment. Here. There you go.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Juan, and indeed thank you, Juan and Everin, for organising this event, and for having me, really. So I will get my slides up. There we go. So that should be up and running there. So today I'm going to be talking about, well, the digital dark ages and the trouble with tech trees, which is, well, it's a title that's largely down to my love for alliteration more than anything. And I should probably also open up by thanking Olga for a really interesting paper and a really thorough consideration of the historiography, the literature around representing the Middle Ages in computer games. And I've been quietly removing a couple of my slides because Olga's done a lot of the heavy lifting there. So thank you very much, Olga. Very briefly then, games and their representation of the Middle Ages are becoming increasingly important. We're seeing a growing volume of games being produced which address the period or address medievalist elements, whether that's fantasy games, whether that's sci-fi games, or whether it's games that are explicitly set within some part of the medieval world. As Olga's highlighted, this is important for a number of reasons, but for me, the main element of importance here is the sheer level of influence these games can have on their players. Games can be a hugely influential media for understanding anything, understanding any period, understanding any subject. This seems to be particularly the case for history. It seems to be particularly the case for pre-modern history, including obviously the Middle Ages. And for this reason, when we need to consider not only what these games represent as the Middle Ages, what stories they're telling, but also why they tell these stories in this particular way. And again, this ties in very closely with a lot of the detail that Olga was giving in her paper. For me, though, the core thing to consider here is a collision between gaming and medievalist tropes within games that represent the Middle Ages. So we see a lot of these standard issue medievalisms being used in the creation of medieval games. Makes perfect sense. Things that we've seen in cinema, in literature, in TV shows. But at the same time, and I think it's something that's really important to emphasize, these tropes come attached to gaming tropes, to things that are common within computer games, a propensity to focus on violence, a tendency to sideline more or less everything else because it's perceived as being boring, an emphasis on Europe and whiteness as the default, all of these different elements. And in many cases, this collision of two different sets of tropes can result in a particularly stereotypical view of the Middle Ages. So one that's very, very violent, one where religion is incredibly important, and so forth. But at the same time, The collision of these two distinct sets of tropes can very often lead in new and unexpected directions. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about one of the key examples of this. And this is a rather strange combination within certain genres of computer game, where we see a representation of the Dark Ages as the default for the Middle Ages, but this is also combined with a particular gaming system, namely the technology trees, perhaps made most famously by the Civilization series. And again, thank you, Olga, for introducing this series so thoroughly in your presentation there. So what I'm going to talk about today is three things. First of all, I want to give a brief overview of the digital Dark Ages. I want to highlight some of the tendencies, some of the most common tropes within representations of the Middle Ages in computer games. I'm then going to go on and talk about the emergence or the use of technology trees within games which represent the Middle Ages. And finally, I'm going to highlight some of the problems with this approach, some of the unusual, perhaps unexpected outcomes of deploying a technology tree as a way of representing the Middle Ages. So let's get started. Part one then, the digital Dark Ages. And as I've said, games about the Middle Ages very commonly rely to a great extent on popular medievalisms. And for the sake of this presentation, for the sake of our discussion of representations of technology, of superstition within the Middle Ages, what we tend to see is the Middle Ages represented in one of two ways, either as a Dark Age or a Golden Age. So anything from Dark Souls, where everything is terrible and will get more terrible as the game and indeed the series progresses, all the way over to these rather stylized representations of Arthur and the Knights of Camelot. And again, this is something that's completely to be expected. It's something that we see in more or less any other form of media representing the Middle Ages, whether it's a very grimdark representation, as we see in, say, Game of Thrones, or whether it's something much more brighter, much more idealistic, something like any of the literature produced by the Romantics, Walter Scott and so forth, even into the works of Tolkien. Beyond that, we see a few nuances. We'll very commonly see a representation of medieval stasis, so nothing will change for thousands of years. Again, this tends to draw very frequently on the works of Tolkien, who provides these massive, massive timelines where very little actually changes. We'll also occasionally see representations of the industrial world as the true Dark Ages. We see a lot of the medievalist trope, a lot of medievalist tropes exported into early modern or even modern settings. A particular example of this being Dishonored, where there are some very clear medievalist tropes being played with within an environment of, well, electricity, gas, gunpowder, and so forth. And of course, we quite often see a conflict being set up within these games between magic, superstition, all these standard medievalist tropes, or industrial tropes. So the example I've gone for here is Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, which is a fairly obscure role-playing game produced in the late 90s. And one of the elements of the plot is this conflict between this medieval world and the emergent industrial world. And in each of these cases, there's the very interesting games, they're very interesting stories to tell. They all rely on medievalism, and to a substantial extent, they're based on common tropes within popular medievalism. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this notional scientific chart here, representing scientific progress throughout the history of mankind, which drops off sharply with the fall of the Roman Empire. And we see, very neatly expressed here, the hole left by the Christian Dark Ages, where things only really start to develop back into some form of progress as we get through to around 1400, 1500, and the Renaissance saves the day. I don't feel the need to go into all the problems with this representation at this point, but I will happily answer questions with this after the presentations. However, these ideas don't come solely from popular medievalism. And a lot of the time, I feel that they've been accentuated. They've been driven to almost comedic levels of extreme through the interaction of these popular medievalist tropes with a number of gaming tropes. So a couple of key examples here. Games tend to be, well, games are almost invariably about progress, whether it's through the story, whether it's about building a better character, a better nation, a better polity. Whatever the player is controlling is meant to get better in some way. One of the easiest ways to do this and ensure balance within the game is to maintain a medieval stasis, to maintain a position where everything is relatively straightforward and nothing actually really tends to change. Alongside this, we have the uber medieval trope of extreme violence, uber gaming trope of extreme violence, exaggerated through a typical representation of the Middle Ages as a hugely violent period. In order to present such a violent world, it's very typical for games to lean very heavily on other less violent medievalist tropes to present everything as being hugely backwards in social and technological terms. In order for this level of barbarism to exist within the game, you have to explain the society which would allow it, which in many cases is this very dark vision of the Middle Ages. And as I've suggested, this is common throughout many games which address the Middle Ages. There is one particular exception to this, and this is the strategy genre. And this, I feel, is primarily driven through the use of medieval tech trees, medieval technology trees. So just very briefly, technology trees are common to a growing range of strategy games. As I've suggested, Sidmeier's Civilization is perhaps the origin point, or at least the most famous early institution of a technology tree. In short, these strategy games, which represent hundreds or thousands of years of human history, they represent progress throughout this period through a series of technologies which can be unlocked typically through dedicating scientists to dedicating funds to perform research. It's a very abstract, it's a very blunt approach, but it does present this outline of progress, this outline of human history as a succession of discoveries. And for our purposes, this is particularly interesting when we see technology trees applied to the Middle Ages. Because, well, as you can see here from, well, this is Civilization 5, we see a range of technologies representing the medieval era, and we see a continuation of this vision of the entirety of human history as inevitable progress, inevitable growth, and an inevitable scientific development. And from this, we gain a vision of a progressive Middle Ages. The Middle Ages aren't dark. They're a progression of scientific advances, just as any other period of history as represented through these strategy games. And it's worth noting just briefly that this is very much the case where, so it's very much seems to be the case that the medievalist tropes of the Dark Ages, this backwards superstitious period, are being overridden by a set of gaming tropes, which requires progress, which requires these civilizations to be able to develop constantly, to never suffer any setbacks, to never suffer a Dark Age. So this is all really interesting, at least on the surface, because we seem to have this very counterintuitive, this very unusual representation of the Middle Ages. They're not the Dark Ages. They slot in very neatly after the progress of the ancient world and before the ongoing progress of the Renaissance. See this nice linear explanation of human history. The Dark Ages do not exist. However, there are a number of problems with this approach, and I've just realized I failed to adjust this, so this is in fact part 3, the trouble with tech trees. And there are a few general issues with the use of technology trees. So first of all, we see these technology trees represent a march of progress. Science is always a good thing. Everything is constantly improving as we move towards the modern world, which is as close to the ideal world as we can humanly make it. This is a school of history which is typically referred to, at least within the Anglophone world, as a Whiggish timeline. Everything is steadily improving as we get towards the modern world. There are various issues with this, which we don't really need to go into a huge amount of depth, but it presents a very flat view of the world. It's a view that doesn't really hold any nuance, and in fact, while it's an alternative to the Dark Ages, it's not really that useful for us thinking about the medieval period. Beyond this, the use of technology trees in general tends to promote a very imperialist and very Eurocentric vision of history. Most typically, these technology trees have been designed around basically building a civilization that will ultimately look suspiciously similar to modern-day America. So I appreciate this isn't quite Eurocentrism, but the purpose works here. So there are general issues with technology trees, but we see some particular issues emerging when we combine technology trees with the medieval period. And a number of these emerge from, again, the confluence of medievalist and gaming tropes. So first of all, we very frequently see the marginalization of the Middle Ages within these technology trees. And I've gone all the way back here to the very first Civilization game, which was published, I want to say, in 1989, but please do correct me later on. If you're looking for the Middle Ages within this technology tree, well, I apologize for the small font size here, but the Middle Ages are effectively represented by two technologies down there towards the bottom of the tree. Much more attention is paid to the modern world, which is fair enough. This is where more technology happens, as far as the designers are concerned at any rate, or even to the ancient or prehistoric world. The Middle Ages have two technologies. They're very much marginalized. It's not a period of technological progress at all in the minds of these developers. It's also worth highlighting that quite often the Middle Ages are still represented as a dead end as far as technology is concerned. So I've zoomed in here on that rather large and unruly map of the technologies from civilization. And we can see here the two medieval technologies. Feudalism, which does nothing, with the exception of allowing you to then go on and research chivalry. Chivalry basically means you can build a slightly better cavalry unit, and chivalry does not lead to anything. So not only did very little of technological worth happen within the Middle Ages, but the Middle Ages have no impact on the rest of the game. They have no impact on the rest of history. And this is something that's become a bit less common over the decades, but certainly in the 80s and the 90s, games tended to very much sideline and marginalize the Middle Ages within these technology trees. We also very frequently see the representation of medieval technology as basically culture. Now, this, to be fair, is common across technology trees for all periods of history. Technological advances have very typically been represented in concert with cultural advances, but it's something that's particularly pronounced within the Middle Ages. So here, taken from the Civilization 4 technology tree, you can see drama, music, philosophy as some of the key technologies present within the Middle Ages. And certainly there are some technological aspects to this. So some of the city improvements that you can build after researching music, they're very clearly built around the development of new instruments. But in essence, though, these are very much cultural developments, cultural changes. But of course, there are difficulties in presenting cultural progress in this manner, presenting this literal or this very linear representation of cultural change. Once again, these technology trees really emphasize the vision of the Middle Ages as being a period of no technology. It's all about the culture. We also tend to see a focus on violence and religion within these technology trees when it comes to the Middle Ages. So feudalism makes a common appearance throughout the civilization series, but it's all about violence. Likewise, engineering sounds like a very socially, economically orientated technology, but within Civilization 4, at least, it allows the creation of a new, more powerful military unit and the construction of military fortifications. Meanwhile, things like theology and divine right, very much about the religious aspects of the Middle Ages. And what we see then is a rather weird combination of these two sets of tropes. We have the progressive tropes coming from the gaming side of things. We see this progression through a series of technologies allowing the player to create a more powerful civilization. But nevertheless, the Middle Ages are still very much represented as a dark period, a period dominated by violence, by religion, and with very little real technological progress. We see effectively a progressive Dark Ages, which is very interesting. I'm not sure how useful it is for teaching people about the Middle Ages then. So, to wrap everything up then, there's a few points I'd like to reiterate and a couple of other issues I'd like to highlight very briefly. So first of all, I'd like to emphasize again that Dark Age tropes are common in computer games. This makes perfect sense. They're common within media of all formats. The Middle Ages will by default be represented as a period of darkness, of superstition, and so forth. There might be a positive spin placed on it, but nevertheless, the Middle Ages are the Middle Ages within the popular imagination. However, the merger of these medievalist tropes with gaming tropes can create some very unexpected representations of the period, and indeed that's what I've argued we see in the case of technology trees and the Middle Ages. We see a an image of progress within the Middle Ages, but nevertheless one which is still very deeply tied to these Dark Age tropes. It's also worth highlighting that this is something that's a broader issue across games as a whole, computer games as a whole. We see a number of unexpected representations of the Middle Ages as a combination of medievalist tropes and gaming tropes. And finally, I really want to emphasize the importance of understanding where these representations come from. The understanding the importance not only of medievalist tropes, but also of gaming tropes in the creation of representations of the Middle Ages in computer games. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was great. That was very, very interesting. Finally, our final panelist for this first panel is Daniel Wigmore. Daniel is in his second year of his PhD in strategy and supply of English coastal barbicans in the late 14th century, which is being supervised by Dr. Craig Lambert at the University of Southampton. He had previously studied for an undergraduate degree in history and a master's degree in medieval history at Royal Holloway University of London, focusing on the response and recovery to French raids in the port of Sandwich in the 1450s. He's recently taken an interest in public history, with a particular focus on the presentation of history in strategy games. So give me a moment, Daniel. I'm going to make you a co-host so you can share your material. There you are. Okay, give it a try.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you both to Olga and Robert for giving the historiography behind kind of medieval game studies, a much more thorough and elegant presentation than I could possibly do. So a lot of what I say has, like as Robert did, kind of has been adjusted a little bit to kind of bear in mind what you've been saying. I'll hopefully just share my screen. Wonderful. Okay. I'd like to preface this kind of talk by setting out a few key points because I think they're quite important to contextualizing what I go on to say. Firstly is that this will broadly be focused on Western Europe on account of my personal understanding of that period, and that it tends to be more focused upon in Western historical strategy games. Also, the positive and negative stereotypes I'll come to discuss later stem from exaggerated notions that fit the modern idea of nations. And for the most part, this is projected onto depictions of pre-modern states that cover a significant portion of regional and local identities that have largely been subsumed within a national whole. Strategy games in general can show much greater breadth of this culture and this history than other types of games. And the examples that I pick to show later, they've been chosen specifically because they've escaped a lot of what the modern consideration towards games have held. So in that these were published before the growing kind of academic examination of games and history. But ultimately what I intend to discuss posits video games less as an active competition or in the pursuit of a victory condition, but more as a representation of a period or of a narrative that history it presents. And this isn't to say that mechanics play no role, and that's far from it. A developer's choices for gameplay or mechanical innovation directly corresponds to representations of themes, ideas, or cultures. And these ideas are often modern, then homogenized, collated, or superimposed upon the historical framework which developers build, and don't always translate neatly with medieval notions of identity or loyalty or nationhood that they're often inspired by. Modern thoughts on nationhood and identity are particularly difficult, and the longevity of some pre-modern states suggests that current loyalties surrounding their successors existed in the same fashion as in the past. Strategy games cannot realistically challenge this notion directly, but in juxtaposing the priorities of enjoyment, education, and the emulsion of these historical details, they can contribute to the public dialogue of how medieval states, nations, and identities are shown. So hopefully, there we go. The most immediately obvious way that games can portray nations is visually. Many states, past and present, have had national icons or imagery that have been favoured or particularly idealised in games. This can come across in banners or altered unit models. But what I'd really like to focus on here is that of colour, especially in games where it cannot be altered by the player. The Total War series, and in this example, the 2006 Medieval 2 Total War, particularly use colour to emphasise national differences. In the game, each faction is based upon a counterpart from medieval Europe and detailed as such. England is in red and gold, while France is in blue and silver, loosely based on the respective royal standards. Other factions are inspired from symbols such as the Holy Roman Empire, whose black and gold units are loosely based on the Reichsadler. While this is most obvious on the battle map, it's similarly reflected on the campaign and various iconography used throughout. The lack of player choice signals this as an intention from the developer, which seems to be a logical progression. It allows for ludological consistency, certainly, and making team identification clear to the player both works within the game itself and within the scope of wider gaming and visual culture. And this, again, works on several levels. Accent colours to differentiate otherwise similarly decorated units, or trimming on unit flags to indicate hostile red or owned green or even allied blue units. And distinguishing units is a key objective to game designers. For example, in a battle between units of England, which are typically red and gold, or Denmark, which are red and white, and Poland, which are then white and red, each faction can generally be clearly identified and differentiated from any other, whether allied or enemy. On the campaign map, colour allows for an immediate understanding of the game world, who controls what, and those provinces that aren't controlled by anyone. And although this follows a pattern in map games generally to satisfy a player urge to kind of colour in the world with your faction, it plays a dual purpose to help illustrate the historical context of the game's start, in this case in 1080. So rebel territories, or grey areas, are kind of a de facto recognition that of political entities that aren't represented by in-game factions, and almost akin to a developer signalling that it's too complicated to be neatly implemented in the game. And for example, the Northumbrian Rebellion of 1080 is highlighted by the York province being rebel-controlled, while the Durazzo rebel-held province on the Greek coast highlights its disputed state prior to the Battle of Dyrrhachium the following year. Part of this is based in game design practices, in which the most effective games build interfaces that can show as much information as quickly and easily as possible. However, there seems to be a consciousness of the complexity of pre-national boundaries, and this is an albeit difficult way to portray this. Particular emphasis, for example, was placed upon Italy, where there are 5 different clearly coloured factions that have started territories in the region as an attempt to try and reflect the nuanced nature of broader Italian politics at the time. And yet there are evident costs and complexities to colour coding combat. In choosing a uniformity of approach, the developers have glossed over an immense variety of colours found in the medieval world in favour of a standardisation for the player's aid. And although effective for the game, it poses a problematic monolithic culture that for states that at the time presented no unified identity. What is more, the choices in colours largely reflect modern identities of pre-modern states, or at a minimum tend to be based on or correlated with exclusively royal standards or colour patterns found in late medieval and early modern kingdoms. In addition to what is often a gentle sidelining of early medieval governments or rulers, it also belittles the role of the factional nobility and of that of regionalisation. So France, in most games, is either depicted in blue and white with a fleur-de-lis, despite the huge difference in regional identities and noble or ducal standards. When this becomes most egregious is when colour choices are either wrongly attributed or misaligned for both game purpose and historical simplification. So continuing with Medieval II Total War, both North African factions, the Moors and Egypt, are similarly shaded beige-brown colours. And Egypt's symbol in game stems from the yellow Ayyubid flag, but hosts the Ottoman Triple Crescent of 1499, despite the Turks being a different playable faction in game. And similarly, the choice of Scotland's blue and white colours modelled on St Andrew's Salter, as opposed to the Scottish red and yellow royal standard, can be traced to ensure more of a clear distinction with England as their primary neighbour, despite the cross not actually being used until the 16th century. Often, a developer's choices of colour can be explained individually like this, but the simplicity and universality of colour makes it difficult to incorporate without some oversimplification. It's the lack of variance and sometimes an inconsistency of approach and implementation that has the potential to confuse or mislead the player of their historical authenticity. And while this is not a criticism of games that take this direction, or of the developers who choose to implement them, it does have the potential to complicate aspects of public understanding and push a false identity on what were disunited provinces or fragmented proto-nation states. While visuals and colours are a very stark and hard to establish nuance, the imposition of broad identities in other ways can be somewhat more subtle. So in Stronghold Crusader and its war chest expansion, for example, AI opponents are characters whose personalities are loosely based upon both stereotypes of European and Arabic rulers, as well as historical figures who took part in exclusively the Third Crusade. And the most pronounced of these are those of the AI's Emperor Frederick and King Philip, loosely based upon Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa and Philip II of France, whose in-game characteristics and accents are very exaggerated stereotypes of the contemporary nation's culture. So, and this is quite an important distinction actually, because Frederick's quite austere, efficient, or almost unemotional portrayal, when coupled with what seems a very aloof or kind of careless romanticism of Philip, play into cultural typecasts born in the early and late modern periods, and not necessarily those at the time. And this, while this is ultimately quite insensitive stereotyping that ignores the complexities of medieval identities and the different reputations of their cultures during the Crusades, there are some counteracting benefits to this approach. So firstly, it works towards a wider goal of presenting multiple historical actors from a variety of cultures. And prior to the game's war chest expansion, all European leaders were English. And this is mostly because they were focused or brought in from the original Stronghold game, which was set in England. And Richard the Lionheart is included as just a crusader kind of opponent. It seems a natural progression for the developers to kind of carry this streak. But the inclusion of expansion AIs and the manipulation of those kind of stereotypes emphasizes a broader diversity within the crusading ranks and contrast with what is sometimes presented as a uniform Western movement. The prominence of these personalities and the loyalties are often comprised kind of conflicting identities within Crusader armies and their leadership, quite crucially. One must have been a conscious decision to choose modern identities as opposed to medieval ones kind of stands in line with this. Those who study medieval history will understand the contrasts between modern and medieval identities. So the predominance of the Franks in the First Crusade or German pogroms against the Jews following outbreaks of Crusader fervour, and also the raiding outside Constantinople, all widely kind of picked up on by contemporary chroniclers. And although these are well known to scholars, they're not often reflected here. And to authentically reproduce such notions within a game is near impossible. To portray such contextual understanding within the scope of an albeit token national generalization is often lost to the player. Games step into a historical period, enrich itself with a period's feelings and messages, and portray an understandable version of this to non-academic perspectives. Imposing modern identities on top of pre-modern leaders is an easily understood method of highlighting the complexity and differences between Western identities and ideas within the Crusades. Yet the AIs of Stronghold Crusader expand beyond the nationalist stereotypes presented in Frederick and Philip, and can together encapsulate a much wider portrayal of multinational identities, and crucially the contrasting nature of their motivations. While strategy games don't allow for a mature examination of medieval ideologies, they can give pause to reflect and suggest multiple moralities around the Middle Ages, and in this case, the Crusades. So here, for example, the Caliph and the Wazir are shown to be quite cruel, short-tempered, and tyrannical rulers in-game, a clear juxtaposition from the pensive and almost laid-back Sultan and Emir. Saladin makes an appearance to mirror chivalry shown in Richard the Lionheart, while a Nizar character embodies the proposed mysteries and assassins of Islamic groups in the 13th century. Western leaders fare relatively similarly in this. So a sleazy English baron, the sheriff, is introduced alongside the abbot as a representative of part of the devout religiosity behind crusading forces. Such characterizations may seem crude, but provide a publicly accessible snapshot of tenets of medieval ideology. So such an approach is mirrored in other strategy games. So Anno 1404, Venice, for example, uses AI characters in a similar way, kind of features or opponents to build a variance of ideas and identities within the period. The aggressive Corsair Hassan ben Zahid, or the frail and welcoming Grand Vizier al-Zahir, in addition to like a variety of smaller neutral powers, kind of dissect, gently dissect the notion of a single Orient to explore. It adds also kind of flavour and colour to this. What games can do is deflect from the traditional dichotomy of West versus East and counter some of the kind of the typical Euro-focused depictions of the Middle Ages in other visual mediums. Many forgo a sense of accuracy in the strictest terms in favour of a broad encompassing of a sense of authenticity in the underlying trends of medievalism. The pursuit of feelings of authenticity can be problematic and ultimately subjective, especially when modern perceptions of what is acceptable as a modern characteristic change, or if the authenticity is questioned as more modern than medieval. But when done well, AI characters can summarize and utilize exaggerated modern stereotypes and perceptions of national and cultural identity for a greater narrative that can dispel quite often harmful baseline myths about medievalism that has been presented in the past. A pursuit of accuracy while still maintaining national dynamics is possible, however, and with caution, a game can exercise national identities that are fundamentally based within and portraying an understanding of the Middle Ages. Age of Empires 2 and its subsequent expansions and remasters excels particularly with this. In-game, each player follows a set typical progression, with ultimately little variance within the mechanics of how it's played, aside some visual differences by culture group, or noticeably the absence of horses for Mesoamerican civilizations. How AoE differentiates the civilizations it samples tends to be more subtle, focusing more closely on mechanical accuracy within faction bonuses, varying use of medieval language, or the specific examples of unique technologies and unique units. I mean, taking the Britons, for example, immediately it's evident that they're not portraying the English, but encapsulating a wider historical grouping within the British Isles, something that can be argued as almost an insensitive imposition of modern national identities, but it's really, I feel, reaching for something a bit greater. In particular, that's to include, at least nominally, the Welsh in English society and recognise their contribution to English successes in the period. An active decision to establish a contemporary precedent that's inclusive but also quite historic. This can be further solidified when examining the bonuses intrinsic to playing as the Britons. Many of these relate to increased range for arch units or faster working archery ranges, and the unique unit of the longbow. The inclusion of a bonus to shepherd work rates further connotes two things. Firstly, it frames the time period in which these Britons are placed, firmly within the high to later Middle Ages, and tailors their playstyle around this history which they're known for. One campaign mission that depicts the Battle of Hastings has the English forces portrayed as by the Goth, or portrayed as the Goth faction, who more closely align with Anglo-Saxon England. Secondly, it establishes a precedent of manipulating this historic perspective of medieval nations as a framework from which to establish control over game balance and game design. I mean, there is, of course, a lot more to medieval Britain than longbows and sheep, but grounding their depiction in medieval realities allows a clear intended playstyle and also asks the player to question why these bonuses exist and invites them to find out more. It's important to bear in mind that people play games to enjoy them, and learning nearly universally takes second place to entertainment value. But by planting seeds of uncertainty and curiosity in why these bonuses relate to certain factions, it can help ignite independent research, or even if just through looking at the provided in-game encyclopedia. It's not expected of the player to understand what the Japanese Yasama or Turkish Sepahit unique texts are, or are meant to represent, but they invite the player to find out more about the medieval portrayals of contemporarily implemented nations. Such implementations in this example are quite few, however. Other factions attempt to summarize a wider ideal without eliciting the potential difficulties of a solid identity. The Teutons and Goths are both chosen to portray German forces in varying time periods in the campaign, and the Franks to summarize all identities within French regions, and the broad Celts to use Scottish, represent Scottish and Irish peoples. The historical conglomeration goes to emphasize the vagueness of medieval identity while also translating some of the small accuracies or inaccuracies that contribute towards a detailed, focused drive for a feeling of authenticity. Franks were the name used to summarize Western forces in the Alexiad after the First Crusade, and units belonging to different factions all in-game use Old or Middle English, French, German, or Gaelic, in addition to medieval Latin. And to what extent these details are appreciated by the player is debatable, yet these complexities add character and subtleties to the mechanical bedrock that are exampled in the Identities previously. So with all that in mind, I'd like to quickly conclude by looking at some initial takeaways from these varying approaches and identify the themes that appear in incorporating aspects of national or medieval identity. And this isn't an encyclopedic list, it's just some examples which I felt were quite prominent and should be mentioned. So firstly, it's obvious that national identities don't have to be contemporary to the period to be introduced or included. And this relates to a wider theme regarding the balance between accuracy and feelings of authenticity. Feeling right is often a lot more important in game design than keeping pace with current scholarship or challenging myths about public conception. Incorporating national sentiments in a way perceived incorrectly can summon criticism, or at worst, just be simply offensive. Secondly, games can utilize these identities for the purpose of a better understanding of medieval history, and to not ferment tropes or continue lingering generalizations. Although many games do sum up history into overly simplified chunks that somewhat diminish these efforts, when done well, they can exemplify the complexities of medieval identity and help challenge underlying assumptions of the period. And this is particularly helpful when quite subtly challenging the traditional narrative of the medieval period that have been co-opted by extremist movements. So care needs to be taken to help avoid the radicalization of medievalist iconography used by these groups, and a delicate approach to medieval identities and ideologies is needed. At minimum, games that attempt to reverse the West and East dichotomy can help make this assimilation more difficult. As games as a form of entertainment have grown, so has the responsibility they bear in avoiding tropes and challenging potential extremist narratives. Strategy games also use the Middle Ages as a setting, but they're not the setting or not the Middle Ages themselves. This, I know, sounds a bit obvious, but by catering to curious players, it can help emphasize the importance of self-learning and understanding of the period. Effective game mechanics or individual snapshot facts about wider national identities helps broaden the scope. At the end of the day, though, ultimately, the inescapable truth is that games are for fun, and unless a game is aiming for a reputation for historical accuracy or a more understanding approach, both players and developers tend to favor gameplay quirks or just simple enjoyment to an impossible reach notion of historical truth. Balancing gameplay and historiosity is key to an effective portrayal of the period, and utilizing modern cultural tropes or perceptions of identity is a great tool for this. However, at the end of the day, it's difficult to say which cultures or whose implementation or what approach is suitable, best, or right. So, thank you. Just pause it.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, and thank you for all our three panelists. Those were very, very interesting presentations. Now we will go for the Q&A for the last 20 minutes that we have for this panel. So for the audience, please write us your questions on the chat and we will read them directly. Meanwhile, we get our first questions. Maybe I would like to begin with one that I think goes through to all our three panelists, because of course, we're here talking about the problems with video games, gameplay, representation, authenticity, etc. And I think that there's like a general idea that I would like maybe the three of you to expand a little bit more. I would like to begin with what Robert said, with this idea of a progressive dark ages, this notion that things progress, but then really nothing changes. And I would like to bring it up, particularly with the case of Age of Empires 2, that I assume the three of you are familiarized with. And I was thinking about it because I think that Age of Empires 2 is a very good example of this particular idea, if one sees the game as a whole. Of course, it has an in-game tech tree and it goes by ages, so it has this notion of progression. However, if one compares this gameplay mechanic, which is clearly teleological, and as Olga and Robert hinted, is clearly based in a Western understanding of historical development, when one, for example, plays the campaigns in these games, they have campaigns for all over the Middle Ages, from Attila to Joan of Arc to William the Conqueror to William Wallace. But despite the fact that in each campaign you have this mechanic of advancing through ages, If one sees, for example, the narratives of these campaigns, a person who is not familiarized with the period would probably have a hard time differentiating when things are happening, not only because units look the same, but because the narrative tropes are always the same. The repressive church, or the evil nobility, or the national hero. For example, what Daniel was mentioning about this idea of the national identity through strategy video games. Age of Empires is a very good example in this, through its campaigns and its narratives, which is based in historical national figures that somehow serve as the image of this, again, anachronistic faction. So what I would like to ask you is, how do you see this very difficult tension between giving a sense of advancement in strategy video games, yet maintaining the medievalist tropes so nothing changes? Because in the end, these medievalist tropes also fit into the national understanding of what is supposed to be the Middle Ages, or what is supposed to be England, what is supposed to be France, etc., etc. So I don't know which of you would like to maybe talk first a little bit.
I can start probably, but
yeah, okay,
well,
yeah, sure.
I do not think that my comment will be too long, but thank you, Juan, for bringing this up, because I also had almost the same question. I wanted to address it to my colleagues about this dark representation of the Middle Ages, because to me, especially in Robert's presentation, this tension was super vivid. And what I wanted to do is to underline that maybe this replication of stereotypes about the Middle Ages is what we should fight as academicians, because, well, this dark, I don't know, under-civilized image of the Middle Ages absolutely does not correspond to the reality which we had, and what I tried to express in my paper. And yeah, basically that's what I wanted to highlight. So colleagues, what do you think? I will appreciate your comments about this very much.
Maybe first Robert and then Daniel.
Brilliant. No, thank you, Anne. Thank you, Olga. That's actually both really good questions, and yeah, conveniently connected there. A lot of it comes down to, well, I suppose a lot of the issue, I think, comes down to creating nuance within games. And by that, I don't necessarily mean having one of these massive games like Civilization, like Crusader Kings, and having everything be ridiculous, having everyone be distinct across those game worlds. I'm increasingly thinking that small games that deal with perhaps down to something the size of a village in different regions around Europe could be the way forward with this. So I appreciate you lose a lot of comparisons there, but at the same time, it gives you a bit more nuance as to what exactly is happening in these little case studies around the map. And to be fair, this is something that's similar with that academic work. If you're going to write a big essay about the entirety of the Middle Ages or the entirety of the medieval world in a given century, it's not going to be a very deep work. If you write on something much smaller, then you can go into much more depth. And I think that's something that will be something that is mirrored within computer games. And I take Olga's point about the replication of stereotypes being something that should really be fought. It's a tricky one because games rely on abstractions in order to make their arguments, in order to make their representations of the past. And as Dan's highlighted, very stereotypes. Something I was thinking about when Dan was speaking is perhaps shifting those stereotypes. So instead of looking at national stereotypes, use stereotypes around professions, around more general hero, villain characters, and maybe get rid of some of the ridiculous accents. Next to a couple of key points which Olga and Dan raised. So first of all, from Olga, Olga, you mentioned with regards to civilization.
I'm sorry, Robert,
I'm gone all over. Sorry, Dan, go for it.
No, I'm wait, sorry, Robert. Your connection, I think, is not very stable.
Okay. Well,
so
I'm sorry.
maybe you would like to turn off your camera.
Yes. Cool.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry about that. Just very briefly, then, Olga, with regards to civilization, highlighted that games can only represent one version of historiography. You can't get the nuances. I think the way to overcome that, you're absolutely right, the way to overcome that is to facilitate user modification. So you change the rules, you change the argument presented by the game, and in turn you can represent a broader historiography. And with Dan, Dan mentioned, games are ultimately meant to be fun. I'm not sure if that's necessarily always the case. I think we're possibly starting to move away from that. We're getting a bit more potential to take a more serious look at the Middle Ages. We're seeing this being done in relation to more modern periods. A number of games have come out recently looking at World War II from a very mature, very sensible perspective. And they're not particularly fun, but they're worthwhile experiences and they do have an audience. So anyway, sorry, I have rambled, so I apologise.
Well, I feel like there's quite a lot to talk about there. I'll first go on to the point about Age of Empires and the campaigns and kind of that multiple division. And I think a lot of that comes down to how the game was developed. Age of Empires 2, I know, was developed initially as a response to Age of Empires 1 and its expansion, The Rise of Rome. And I know that it was narratively, when in development, it was following that and deliberately trying to kind of home into at least initially a Dark Age vibe. And that's why the Age of the Conquerors, the first expansion, was focused a lot more on the kind of later medieval things, such as Mesoamerican civilizations and the Spanish. That's a reason, as far as I'm aware. I also agree with Robert completely about a lot of on the ideas of emphasizing a nuance to things. And one of the points I wanted to make but didn't really manage to fit in was an idea that a lot of these accents and kind of identities are very exaggerated and almost deliberately ridiculous. In game, when you're selecting units in Stronghold Crusader, all of the different types of units are stereotypes of different, almost professions, almost cultural kind of typecasts. So pikemen are from Yorkshire, for example, and all the knights are incredibly aristocratic. And I think that kind of plays into a lot of notions of identity. As one point I wanted to also mention about the games being fun, that's also something I really want to kind of look into a bit more, because as games have gone on, been more recently developed, there's a lot more focus on in-game encyclopedias and kind of emphasizing a narrative. And while I think more widely games are transitioning a lot more to an art form than kind of a competition, I think the ones I was looking at are more competitive in mind. They're a lot more focused on beating someone else. Well, I completely agree that games are shifting away from the kind of fun-focused narrative, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. We have a question in the chat. Mateus Silva, he says, thank you all for the lectures. It was very interesting. Robert, you talked about, so this question is for Robert, you talked about the tech trees in games primarily in the Civilization series. The latest Crusader Kings games added a tech tree component to its core gameplay. In your opinion, how does the game handle this component? Maybe for those of you in the audience who are not that related or that familiarized with video games, Crusader Kings is also a strategy series video game, relatively, well, very famous. And it takes, for example, in this balance between historicity and gameplay, it takes, to some extent, like the extreme of historicity version being so detailed that it's actually rather difficult to play. So that is Mateus' question. So Rob, I don't know if you would like to answer.
Thank you, Matthias. And indeed, I suspect Olga and Dan may want to come in on this as well. May want to come on this. Yes, Crusader Kings is really interesting for a lot of reasons. As Matthias says, there is this technology tree component within the game, and in fact, I suppose is a very rudimentary one in every iteration of the series, where you see, well, notional technological progress. So Crusader Kings does some interesting things with its technology, and there's very different ways of how things are researched. So it's not generally as centralized as in a lot of other games. Nevertheless, there's still this very driven, very singular pattern of progress. It's very much well, you get the next level of technology, you receive a power up. It's always going to progress in exactly the same way. So I think it's an interesting experiment, but I think ultimately it falls foul of a lot of the same issues that we've seen with civilization and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Jan Kramer has a question and he would like to ask it directly. So give me a moment, I'm going to unmute you. There, can you? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you for all the very interesting 3 papers. I have to say hello to Olga and Robert. My question must be about the Kingdom Come Deliverance. I think Olga is expecting it. If I correctly understood what you've been saying, is that those 2 cases, in the case of Civilization 5 and in the case of Kingdom Come Deliverance, you say that in the scope of procedural rhetoric, Kingdom Come brings us nearer to history, or what we as academicians think about history. Or I'm not sure if you said that it shows it brings us nearer to history in a different way, because yeah, I'm not really keen of using procedural rhetoric in case of RPGs. I think it's very reductive in this case. I think it's more suitable for simulation style games as strategies. Because my point is, finally, if we compare, for example, because you were saying like the tech tree in Civilization and then the social structure in Kingdom Come, but we can turn it around. It's a matter of selection. If we talk about the presentation of nationhood or identity in general, sexuality or religiosity in general, then RPG as Kingdom Come in eyes of academics must fail terribly. But in the same case, on the other hand, in the case of Civilization 5 and even more in Civilization 6, if we and better if we include the DLCs, the representation of religiosity and the church and the influence on society is much more nuanced and much more let's say realistic or authentic. Okay, much closer what we expect of it as historians. So I think it's question of selection. What would you select in different genre, different forms, and even if I think we shouldn't only focus on the rules as bogus rights, but really make a wider scope to include gameplay and the whole culture around those games. But you know, it doesn't fit in 20 minutes. I do understand this. And one last remark to Daniel. It was super exciting to listen to, but I would add, and I think it was already mentioned, if we mention Crusader Kings 3, the 3rd installment of the series, this really addresses a lot of issues that you were addressing in your paper, especially the identity things, using families and families trees and dynasties in Crusader Kings 3 totally changes the whole point of the game, and it turns us much nearer to what we are used to from our sources as medievalists. Thank you.
Yeah, so Olga, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Awesome question, and yeah, I'm glad to see you among the audience. I can probably give you several comments as a small reply to your question. So you have just told that, well, this procedural or simulation rhetoric is more visible and nuanced in strategic games, if I understood correctly, and maybe RPGs do not, well, fit this methodology. But maybe this is one of the reasons why RPGs and action games were underrepresented in the modern scholarship about this procedurality. So that's the first remark. And the second remark is that, well, I agree that rules can be studied in this procedural rhetoric, but what I tried to do is to assess not rules, but rather my experience of fails and wins while playing games. So I tried to assess processes and how the game boosted my experience, boosted my advancement through its narrative and the whole playthrough experience. And I guess this is maybe one of the many sideways that one can undertake while studying this procedural rhetoric. And also the last comment about nationalism and Kingdom Come Deliverance. Yes, I guess it's a hot discussed topic since 2018, especially for the Czech audience. Well, I guess every time when one mentions Kingdom Come Deliverance, someone brings up this huge discussion in the internet about whiteness and people of color who were not presented in the game. So yes, I agree that in some ways Kingdom Come Deliverance failed to present this accurate, well, objective, so to say, representation of the Middle Ages, yes. But what I loved especially is its anthropological, hyper-realistic approach to the Middle Ages. So maybe not the main narrative or the main message of the game about this nationalism, importance of the Czech nation and so forth, but these small details, how the whole society works. Thanks.
Thank you. We it's already 3, but we're going to take like 5 more minutes, maybe for one last question before we close today. Jordan Volts asks the following. He says, "Thank you for the presentations. An aspect which I consider to be fundamental to game analysis is the situation of the player within the play experience and the agency which they are able to exercise. Grand strategy games, the majority of the games discussed in this panel, situate the player in different ways. And I'm especially curious on your opinion on how the player's embodiment in the play and the agency expressed by the player reinforces certain understanding of identity and power in the Middle Ages," which is a very complicated question, but let's try to tackle it in 5 minutes. So I don't know which one of you would like maybe to give some remarks first. Maybe Daniel, would you like to go first?
I'll give it a quick shot. I think there's a difference between being situated in a grand strategy game and almost a narrative placed upon you in that way. So in a game like Civilization 5 or 6, or the more procedurally generated ones, I feel it's much more player-based, if that makes sense. And if you take an individual identity of a campaign or a narrative which you're placed within, I think that's much more careful in how the actions you're forced to take. So in RPGs or narrative games more widely, I think that's when Advaita can really emphasize notions of identity or kind of power dynamics in a way, while in the more procedural ones or the grand strategy ones where you're much more free to make your own narrative decisions, I think that's almost, you have to have the mechanical bedrock of an understanding of the medieval period and almost not correct implementation, but a certain level of, well, I don't know how to word it properly really, but it's that you have to, I feel like you have to have a kind of mechanical bedrock of the Middle Ages from which to build a grand strategy from, as opposed to a campaign where you have to focus more down your player choices and what happens, if that makes sense.
Robert, Olga, would you like to add? Yeah, Robert.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, Olga, unless you want to go first. No, sorry. That's very rude of me. I suppose, yeah, this is a really important point, and I'm gonna some shameless self-promotion. I've got a chapter coming out relating to this within Crusader Kings, or Crusader Kings 2 specifically. And you're absolutely right, Jordan. The role of, and again, it's echoing something Jan said, isn't it? The role of the player is really vital in the sort of history these games present. And so what I found with Crusader Kings 2 is the vast majority of players play to conquer the world, or at least to conquer a substantial part of the world. And this is despite the fact that the game doesn't really give you any objectives. You just let loose with a family and do what you want to do. And you can play completely peacefully if you want to. You can build an economic empire. You can just hang around in your court having feasts for 400 years. But the vast majority of players try to conquer the world. And they're bringing this baggage with them. It's partly what they expect from the Middle Ages. It's partly what they expect from a strategy game. And that has a huge impact on the sort of history they represent through these games. I wonder if with Crusader Kings, it's in part because there are substantial role-playing elements within the game. So you do see yourself as this combatant, this conqueror. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm acutely aware of the time, so I will stop my rant there. But if anybody would like access to that, then yeah, please do drop me an email. I'll quite happily send you the chapter.
Maybe, of course, if Daniel, Olga, and Robert are okay with it, maybe you can share your email accounts in the chat so people can ask you questions, because we're pretty much out of time. Again, I would like to thank everybody. I would like to thank the audience. I would like to thank our panelists. It was a very, very interesting panel. We will reconvene in 25 minutes for our last panel today, which is medieval ideas, practices, and attitudes on screen. Again, remember that is just with the same link that you access this, the conference. If you want to, you don't have to log on. I will just put you all in the waiting room, and we will let you back in at 3:30. So again, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you in a while. Thank you very much.